Chapter 4. The farther I got below Washington, the more disappointed I became in the appearance of the country. I peered through the car windows, looking in vain for the luxuriant, semi-tropical scenery which I had pictured in my mind. I did not find the grass so green, nor the woods so beautiful, nor the flowers so plentiful as they were in Connecticut. Instead, the red earth, partly covered by tough, scrawny grass, the muddy, straggling roads, the cottages of unpainted pine boards, and the clay-daubed huts imparted a burnt-up impression. Occasionally we ran through a little white and green village that was like an oasis in a desert. When I reached Atlanta, my steadily increasing disappointment was not lessened. I found it a big, dull red town. This dull red color of that part of the South I was then seeing had much, I think, to do with the extreme depression of my spirits. No public squares, no fountains, dingy street cars, and with the exception of 3 or 4 principal thoroughfares, unpaved streets. It was raining when I arrived, and some of these unpaved streets were absolutely impassable. Wheels sank to the hubs in red mire, and I actually stood for an hour and watched 4 or 5 men work to save a mule which had stepped into a deep sink from drowning, or rather suffocating in the mud. The Atlanta of today is a new city. On the train I had talked with one of the Pullman car porters, a bright young fellow who was himself a student, and I told him that I was going to Atlanta to attend school. I had also asked him to tell me where I might stop for a day or two until the university opened. He said I might go with him to the place where he stopped during his layovers in Atlanta. I gladly accepted his offer and went with him along one of those muddy streets until we came to a rather rickety-looking frame house, which we entered. The proprietor of the house was a big, fat, greasy-looking, brown-skinned man. When I asked him if he could give me accommodations, he wanted to know how long I would stay. I told him perhaps 2 days, not more than 3. In reply, he said, "Oh, that's all right, then," at the same time leading the way up a pair of creaky stairs. I followed him and the porter to a room, the door of which the proprietor opened, while continuing, it seemed, his remark, "Oh, that's all right, then," by adding, "You can sleep in that cot in the corner there. 50 cents, please." The porter interrupted by saying, "You needn't collect from him now. He's got a trunk." This seemed to satisfy the man, and he went down, leaving me and my porter friend in the room. I glanced around the apartment and saw that it contained a double bed and 2 cots, 2 wash stands, 3 chairs, and a time-worn bureau with a looking-glass that would have made Adonis appear hideous. I looked at the cot in which I was to sleep and suspected, not without good reason, that I should not be the first to use the sheets and pillowcase since they had last come from the wash. When I thought of the clean, tidy, comfortable surroundings in which I had been reared, a wave of homesickness swept over me that made me feel faint. Had it not been for the presence of my companion, and that I knew this much of his history, that he was not yet quite 20, just 3 years older than myself, and that he had been fighting his own way in the world, earning his own living, and providing for his own education since he was 14, I should not have been able to stop the tears that were welling up in my eyes. I asked him why it was that the proprietor of the house seemed unwilling to accommodate me for more than a couple of days. He informed me that the man ran a lodging house especially for Pullman porters, and as their stays in town were not longer than 1 or 2 nights, it would interfere with his arrangements to have anyone stay longer. He went on to say, "You see, this room is fixed up to accommodate 4 men at a time. Well, by keeping a sort of table of trips in and out of the men and working them like checkers, he can accommodate 15 or 16 in each week, and generally avoid having an empty bed. You happen to catch a bed that would have been empty for a couple of nights." I asked him where he was going to sleep. He answered, "I sleep in that other cot tonight. Tomorrow night I go out." He went on to tell me that the man who kept the house did not serve meals, and that if I was hungry, we would go out and get something to eat. We went into the street, and in passing the railroad station I hired a wagon to take my trunk to my lodging place. We passed along until finally we turned into a street that stretched away up and down hill for a mile or 2, and here I caught my first sight of colored people in large numbers. I had seen little squads around the railroad stations on my way south, but here I saw a street crowded with them. They filled the shops and thronged the sidewalks and lined the curb. I asked my companion if all the colored people in Atlanta lived in this street. He said they did not, and assured me that the ones I saw were of the lower class. I felt relieved, in spite of the size of the lower class. The unkempt appearance, the shambling, slouching gait, and loud talk and laughter of these people aroused in me a feeling of almost repulsion. Only one thing about them awoke a feeling of interest. That was their dialect. I had read some Negro dialect and had heard snatches of it on my journey down from Washington, but here I heard it in all of its fullness and freedom. I was particularly struck by the way in which it was punctuated by such exclamatory phrases as, "Lord a mercy," "Gone, man," "Bless my soul," "Look here, child." These people talked and laughed without restraint. In fact, they talked straight from their lungs and laughed from the pits of their stomachs, and this hearty laughter was often justified by the droll humor of some remark. I paused long enough to hear one man say to another, "What's the matter with you and your friend Sam?" And the other came back like a flash, "My friend? He my friend? Man, I'd go to his funeral just the same as I'd go to a minstrel show." I have since learned that this ability to laugh heartily is in part the salvation of the American Negro. It does much to keep him from going the way of the Indian. The business places of the street along which we were passing consisted chiefly of low bars, cheap dry goods and notion stores, barber shops, and fish and bread restaurants. We at length turned down a pair of stairs that led to a basement, and I found myself in an eating house somewhat better than those I had seen in passing. But that did not mean much for its excellence. The place was smoky, the tables were covered with oilcloth, the floor with sawdust, and from the kitchen came a rancid odor of fish fried over several times, which almost nauseated me. I asked my companion if this was the place where we were to eat. He informed me that it was the best place in town where a colored man could get a meal. I then wanted to know why somebody didn't open a place where respectable colored people who had money could be accommodated. He answered, "It wouldn't pay. All the respectable colored people eat at home, and the few who travel generally have friends in the towns to which they go who entertain them." He added, "Of course, you could go in any place in the city. They wouldn't know you from white." I sat down with the porter at one of the tables, but was not hungry enough to eat with any relish what was put before me. The food was not badly cooked, but the iron knives and forks needed to be scrubbed. The plates and dishes and glasses needed to be washed and well dried. I minced over what I took on my plate while my companion ate. When we finished, we paid the waiter 20 cents each and went out. We walked around until the lights of the city were lit. Then the porter said that he must get to bed and have some rest, as he had not had 6 hours sleep since he left Jersey City. I went back to our lodging house with him. When I awoke in the morning, there were, besides my new-found friend, 2 other men in the room, asleep in the double bed. I got up and dressed myself very quietly, so as not to awake anyone. I then drew from under the pillow my precious roll of greenbacks, took out a $10 bill, and very softly unlocking my trunk, put the remainder, about $300, in the inside pocket of a coat near the bottom, glad of the opportunity to put it unobserved in a place of safety. When I had carefully locked my trunk, I tiptoed toward the door with the intention of going out to look for a decent restaurant where I might get something fit to eat. As I was easing the door open, my porter friend said with a yawn, "Oh, hello. You're going out?" I answered him, "Yes." "Oh," he yawned again. "I guess I've had enough sleep. Wait a minute. I'll go with you." For the instant, his friendship bored and embarrassed me. I had visions of another meal in the greasy restaurant of the day before. He must have divined my thoughts, for he went on to say, "I know a woman across town who takes a few boarders. I think we can go over there and get a good breakfast." With a feeling of mingled fears and doubts regarding what the breakfast might be, I waited until he had dressed himself. When I saw the neat appearance of the cottage we entered, my fears vanished, and when I saw the woman who kept it, my doubts followed the same course. Scrupulously clean, in a spotless white apron and colored head handkerchief, her round face beaming with motherly kindness, she was picturesquely beautiful. She impressed me as one broad expanse of happiness and good nature. In a few minutes she was addressing me as "Cha" and "Honey." She made me feel as though I should like to lay my head on her capacious bosom and go to sleep. And the breakfast, simple as it was, I could not have had at any restaurant in Atlanta, at any price. There was fried chicken, as it is fried only in the South, hominy boiled to the consistency where it could be eaten with a fork, and biscuits so light and flaky that a fellow with any appetite at all would have no difficulty in disposing of 8 or 10. When I had finished, I felt that I had experienced the realization of at least one of my dreams of Southern life. During the meal we found out from our hostess, who had 2 boys in school, that Atlanta University opened on that very day. I had somehow mixed my dates. My friend, the porter, suggested that I go out to the university at once, and offered to walk over and show me the way. We had to walk because, although the university was not more than 20 minutes' distance from the center of the city, there were no streetcars running in that direction. My first sight of the school grounds made me feel that I was not far from home. Here the red hills had been terraced and covered with green grass. Clean gravel walks, well shaded, led up to the buildings. Indeed, it was a bit of New England transplanted. At the gate, my companion said he would bid me good-bye because it was likely that he would not see me again before his car went out. He told me that he would make 2 more trips to Atlanta and that he would come out and see me, that after his second trip he would leave the Pullman service for the winter and return to school in Nashville. We shook hands, I thanked him for all his kindness, and we said goodbye. I walked up to a group of students and made some inquiries. They directed me to the president's office in the main building. The president gave me a cordial welcome. It was more than cordial. He talked to me, not as the official head of a college, but as though he were adopting me into what was his large family, personally to look after my general welfare as well as my education. He seemed especially pleased with the fact that I had come to them all the way from the North. He told me that I could have come to the school as soon as I had reached the city and that I had better move my trunk out at once. I gladly promised him that I would do so. He then called a boy and directed him to take me to the matron and to show me around afterwards. I found the matron even more motherly than the president was fatherly. She had me register, which was in effect to sign a pledge to abstain from the use of intoxicating beverages, tobacco, and profane language while I was a student at the school. This act caused me no sacrifice, as up to that time I was free from all 3 habits. The boy who was with me then showed me about the grounds. I was especially interested in the industrial building. The sounding of a bell, he told me, was the signal for the students to gather in the General Assembly Hall, and he asked me if I would go. Of course I would. There were between 300 and 400 students, and perhaps all of the teachers gathered in the room. I noticed that several of the latter were colored. The president gave a talk addressed principally to newcomers, but I scarcely heard what he said. I was so much occupied in looking at those around me. They were of all types and colors, the more intelligent types predominating. The colors ranged from jet black to pure white, with light hair and eyes. Among the girls especially, there were many so fair that it was difficult to believe that they had Negro blood in them. And, too, I could not help noticing that many of the girls, particularly those of the delicate brown shades, with black eyes and wavy dark hair, were decidedly pretty. Among the boys, many of the blackest were fine specimens of young manhood, tall, straight, and muscular, with magnificent heads. These were the kind of boys who developed into the patriarchal uncles of the old slave regime. When I left the university, it was with the determination to get my trunk and move out to the school before night. I walked back across the city with a light step and a light heart. I felt perfectly satisfied with life for the first time since my mother's death. In passing the railroad station, I hired a wagon and rode with the driver as far as my stopping place. I settled with my landlord and went upstairs to put away several articles I had left out. As soon as I opened my trunk, a dart of suspicion shot through my heart. The arrangement of things did not look familiar. I began to dig down excitedly to the bottom till I reached the coat in which I had concealed my treasure. My money was gone, every single bill of it. I knew it was useless to do so, but I searched through every other coat, every pair of trousers, every vest, and even each pair of socks. When I had finished my fruitless search, I sat down dazed and heartsick. I called the landlord up and informed him of my loss. He comforted me by saying that I ought to have better sense than to keep money in a trunk, and that he was not responsible for his lodger's personal effects. His cooling words brought me enough to my senses to cause me to look and see if anything else was missing. Several small articles were gone, among them a black and gray necktie of odd design upon which my heart was set. Almost as much as the loss of my money, I felt the loss of my tie. After thinking for a while as best I could, I wisely decided to go at once back to the university and lay my troubles before the president. I rushed breathlessly back to the school. As I neared the grounds, the thought came across me, would not my story sound fishy? Would it not place me in the position of an impostor or beggar? What right had I to worry these busy people with the results of my carelessness? If the money could not be recovered, and I doubted that it could, what good would it do to tell them about it? The shame and embarrassment which the whole situation gave me caused me to stop at the gate. I paused, undecided for a moment, then turned and slowly retraced my steps, and so changed the whole course of my life. If the reader has never been in a strange city without money or friends, it is useless to try to describe what my feelings were. He could not understand. If he has been, it is equally useless, for he understands more than words could convey. When I reached my lodgings, I found in the room one of the porters who had slept there the night before. When he heard what misfortune had befallen me, he offered many words of sympathy and advice. He asked me how much money I had left. I told him that I had $10 or $12 in my pocket. He said, "That won't last you very long here, and you will hardly be able to find anything to do in Atlanta. I'll tell you what you do. Go down to Jacksonville, and you won't have any trouble to get a job in one of the big hotels there, or in St. Augustine." I thanked him, but intimated my doubts of being able to get to Jacksonville on the money I had. He reassured me by saying, "Oh, that's all right. You express your trunk on through, and I'll take you down in my closet." I thanked him again, not knowing then what it was to travel in a Pullman porter's closet. He put me under a deeper debt of gratitude by lending me $15, which he said I could pay back after I had secured work. His generosity brought tears to my eyes, and I concluded that, after all, there were some kind hearts in the world. I now forgot my troubles in the hurry and excitement of getting my trunk off in time to catch the train, which went out at 7 o'clock. I even forgot that I hadn't eaten anything since morning. We got a wagon, the porter went with me, and took my trunk to the express office. My new friend then told me to come to the station at about 7:15 and walk straight to the car where I should see him standing, and not lose my nerve. I found my role not so difficult to play as I thought it would be, because the train did not leave from the central station, but from a smaller one, where there were no gates and guards to pass. I followed directions, and the porter took me on his car and locked me in his closet. In a few minutes the train pulled out for Jacksonville. I may live to be 100 years old, but I shall never forget the agonies I suffered that night. I spent 12 hours doubled up in the porter's basket for soiled linen, not being able to straighten up on account of the shelves for clean linen just over my head. The air was hot and suffocating, and the smell of damp towels and used linen was sickening. At each lurch of the car over the none too smooth track, I was bumped and bruised against the narrow walls of my narrow compartment. I became acutely conscious of the fact that I had not eaten for hours. Then nausea took possession of me, and at one time I had grave doubts about reaching my destination alive. If I had the trip to make again, I should prefer to walk. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of the Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. The next morning I got out of the car at Jacksonville, with a stiff and aching body. I determined to ask no more porters, not even my benefactor, about stopping places. So I found myself on the street, not knowing where to go. I walked along listlessly until I met a colored man who had the appearance of a preacher. I asked him if he could direct me to a respectable boarding house for colored people. He said that if I walked along with him in the direction he was going, he would show me such a place. I turned and walked at his side. He proved to be a minister and asked me a great many direct questions about myself. I answered as many as I saw fit to answer. The others I evaded or ignored. At length we stopped in front of a frame house, and my guide informed me that it was the place. A woman was standing in the doorway, and he called to her, saying that he had brought her a new boarder. I thanked him for his trouble, and after he had urged upon me to attend his church while I was in the city, he went on his way. I went in and found the house neat and not uncomfortable. The parlor was furnished with cane-bottomed chairs, each of which was adorned with a white crocheted tidy. The mantel over the fireplace had a white crocheted cover. A marble-topped center table held a lamp, a photograph album, and several trinkets, each of which was set upon a white crocheted mat. There was a cottage organ in a corner of the room, and I noted that the lamp racks upon it were covered with white crocheted mats. There was a matting on the floor, but a white crocheted carpet would not have been out of keeping. I made the arrangements with the landlady for my board and lodging. The amount was, I think, $3.50 a week. She was a rather fine-looking, stout, brown-skinned woman of about 40 years of age. Her husband was a light-colored Cuban, a man about one-half her size, and one whose age could not be guessed from his appearance. He was small in size, but a handsome black mustache and typical Spanish eyes redeemed him from insignificance. I was in time for breakfast, and at the table I had the opportunity to see my fellow boarders. There were 8 or 10 of them. 2, as I afterwards learned, were colored Americans. All of them were cigar makers and worked in one of the large factories. Cigar making is one trade in which the color line is not drawn. The conversation was carried on entirely in Spanish, and my ignorance of the language subjected me more to alarm than embarrassment. I had never heard such uproarious conversation. Everybody talked at once. Loud exclamations, rolling carambas, menacing gesticulations with knives, forks, and spoons. I looked every moment for the clash of blows. One man was emphasizing his remarks by flourishing a cup in his hand, seemingly forgetful of the fact that it was nearly full of hot coffee. He ended by emptying it over what was relatively the only quiet man at the table excepting myself, bringing from him a volley of language which made the others appear dumb by comparison. I soon learned that in all of this clatter of voices and table utensils, they were discussing purely ordinary affairs and arguing about mere trifles, and that not the least ill feeling was aroused. It was not long before I enjoyed the spirited chatter and badinage at the table as much as I did my meals, and the meals were not bad. I spent the afternoon in looking around the town. The streets were sandy, but were well shaded by fine oak trees and far preferable to the clay roads of Atlanta. 1 or 2 public squares with green grass and trees gave the city a touch of freshness. That night after supper, I spoke to my landlady and her husband about my intentions. They told me that the big winter hotels would not open within 2 months. It can easily be imagined what effect this news had on me. I spoke to them frankly about my financial condition and related the main fact of my misfortune in Atlanta. I modestly mentioned my ability to teach music and asked if there was any likelihood of my being able to get some scholars. My landlady suggested that I speak to the preacher who had shown me her house. She felt sure that through his influence I should be able to get up a class in piano. She added, however, that the colored people were poor, and that the general price for music lessons was only 25 cents. I noticed that the thought of my teaching white pupils did not even remotely enter her mind. None of this information made my prospects look much brighter. The husband, who up to this time had allowed the woman to do most of the talking, gave me the first bit of tangible hope. He said that he could get me a job as a stripper in the factory where he worked, and that if I succeeded in getting some music pupils, I could teach a couple of them every night, and so make a living until something better turned up. He went on to say that it would not be a bad thing for me to stay at the factory and learn my trade as a cigar maker, and impressed on me that for a young man knocking about the country, a trade was a handy thing to have. I determined to accept his offer and thanked him heartily. In fact, I became enthusiastic, not only because I saw a way out of my financial troubles, but also because I was eager and curious over the new experience I was about to enter. I wanted to know all about the cigar-making business. This narrowed the conversation down to the husband and myself, so the wife went in and left us talking. He was what is called a regalia workman, and earned from $35 to $40 a week. He generally worked a $60 job. That is, he made cigars for which he was paid at the rate of $60 per thousand. It was impossible for him to make 1,000 in a week because he had to work very carefully and slowly. Each cigar was made entirely by hand. Each piece of filler and each wrapper had to be selected with care. He was able to make a bundle of 100 cigars in a day, not one of which could be told from the others by any difference in size or shape, or even by any appreciable difference in weight. This was the acme of artistic skill in cigar making. Workmen of this class were rare, never more than 3 or 4 in one factory, and it was never necessary for them to remain out of work. There were men who made 200, 300, and 400 cigars of the cheaper grades in a day. They had to be very fast in order to make a decent week's wages. Cigar making was a rather independent trade. The men went to work when they pleased, and knocked off when they felt like doing so. As a class, the workmen were careless and improvident. Some very rapid workers would not work more than 3 or 4 days out of the week, and there were others who never showed up at the factory on Mondays. Strippers were the boys who pulled the long stems from the tobacco leaves. After they had served at that work for a certain time, they were given tables as apprentices. All of this was interesting to me, and we drifted along in conversation until my companion struck the subject nearest his heart, the independence of Cuba. He was an exile from the island and a prominent member of the Jacksonville junta. Every week, sums of money were collected from juntas all over the country. This money went to buy arms and ammunition for the insurgents. As the man sat there nervously smoking his long green cigar, and telling me of the Gomez's, both the white one and the black one, of Maceo and Bandera, he grew positively eloquent. He also showed that he was a man of considerable education and reading. He spoke English excellently, and frequently surprised me by using words one would hardly expect from a foreigner. The first one of this class of words he employed almost shocked me, and I never forgot it. 'Twas ramify. We sat on the piazza until after 10 o'clock. When we arose to go in to bed, it was with the understanding that I should start in the factory on the next day. I began work the next morning seated at a barrel with another boy, who showed me how to strip the stems from the leaves, to smooth out each half leaf, and to put the rights together in one pile and the lefts together in another pile on the edge of the barrel. My fingers, strong and sensitive from their long training, were well adapted to this kind of work, and within 2 weeks I was accounted the fastest stripper in the factory. At first, the heavy odor of the tobacco almost sickened me, but when I became accustomed to it, I liked the smell. I was now earning $4 a week, and was soon able to pick up a couple more by teaching a few scholars at night, whom I had secured through the good offices of the preacher I had met on my first morning in Jacksonville. At the end of about 3 months, through my skill as a stripper and the influence of my landlord, I was advanced to a table and began to learn my trade. In fact, more than my trade, for I learned not only to make cigars, but also to smoke, to swear, and to speak Spanish. I discovered that I had a talent for languages as well as for music. The rapidity and ease with which I acquired Spanish astonished my associates. In a short time, I was able not only to understand most of what was said at the table during meals, but to join in the conversation. I bought a method for learning the Spanish language, and with the aid of my landlord as a teacher, by constant practice with my fellow workmen, and by regularly reading the Cuban newspapers, and finally some books of standard Spanish literature, which were at the house, I was able in less than a year to speak like a native. In fact, it was my pride that I spoke better Spanish than many of the Cuban workmen at the factory. After I had been in the factory a little over a year, I was repaid for all the effort I had put forth to learn Spanish by being selected as reader. The reader is quite an institution in all cigar factories which employ Spanish-speaking workmen. He sits in the center of the large room in which the cigar makers work and reads to them for a certain number of hours each day all the important news from the papers and whatever else he may consider would be interesting. He often selects an exciting novel and reads it in daily installments. He must, of course, have a good voice, but he must also have a reputation among the men for intelligence, for being well posted, and having in his head a stock of varied information. He is generally the final authority on all arguments which arise, and in a cigar factory these arguments are many and frequent, ranging from the respective and relative merits of rival baseball clubs to the duration of the sun's light and energy. Cigar making is a trade in which talk does not interfere with work. My position as reader not only released me from the rather monotonous work of rolling cigars and gave me something more in accord with my tastes, but also added considerably to my income. I was now earning about $25 a week and was able to give up my peripatetic method of giving music lessons. I hired a piano and taught only those who could arrange to take their lessons where I lived. I finally gave up teaching entirely, as what I made scarcely paid for my time and trouble. I kept the piano, however, in order to keep up my own studies, and occasionally I played at some church concert or other charitable entertainment. Through my music teaching and my not absolutely irregular attendance at church, I became acquainted with the best class of colored people in Jacksonville. This was really my entrance into the race. It was my initiation into what I have termed the Freemasonry of the race. I had formulated a theory of what it was to be colored. Now I was getting the practice. The novelty of my position caused me to observe and consider things which, I think, entirely escaped the young men I associated with, or, at least, were so commonplace to them as not to attract their attention. And of many of the impressions which came to me then, I have realized the full import only within the past few years, since I have had a broader knowledge of men in history, and a fuller comprehension of the tremendous struggle which is going on between the races in the South. It is a struggle, for though the black man fights passively, he nevertheless fights, and his passive resistance is more effective at present than active resistance could possibly be. He bears the fury of the storm as does the willow tree. It is a struggle, for though the white man of the South may be too proud to admit it, he is nevertheless using in the contest his best energies. He is devoting to it the greater part of his thought and much of his endeavor. The South today stands panting and almost breathless from its exertions. And how the scene of the struggle has shifted. The battle was first waged over the right of the Negro to be classed as a human being with a soul. Later, as to whether he had sufficient intellect to master even the rudiments of learning. And today it is being fought out over his social recognition. I said somewhere in the early part of this narrative that because the colored man looked at everything through the prism of his relationship to society as a colored man, and because most of his mental efforts ran through the narrow channel bounded by his rights and his wrongs, it was to be wondered at that he has progressed so broadly as he has. The same thing may be said of the white man of the South. Most of his mental efforts run through one narrow channel. His life as a man and a citizen, many of his financial activities, and all of his political activities are impassably limited by the ever-present Negro question. I am sure it would be safe to wager that no group of Southern white men could get together and talk for 60 minutes without bringing up the race question. If a northern white man happened to be in the group, the time could be safely cut to 30 minutes. In this respect, I consider the conditions of the whites more to be deplored than that of the blacks. Here, a truly great people, a people that produced a majority of the great historic Americans from Washington to Lincoln, now forced to use up its energies in a conflict as lamentable as it is violent. I shall give the observations I made in Jacksonville as seen through the light of after years, and they apply generally to every Southern community. The colored people may be said to be roughly divided into three classes, not so much in respect to themselves as in respect to their relations with the whites. There are those constituting what might be called the desperate class, the men who work in the lumber and turpentine camps, the ex-convicts, the barroom loafers, are all in this class. These men conform to the requirements of civilization much as a trained lion with low muttered growls goes through his stunts under the crack of the trainer's whip. They cherish a sullen hatred for all white men, and they value life as cheap. I have heard more than one of them say, "I'll go to hell for the first white man that bothers me." Many who have expressed that sentiment have kept their word, and it is that fact which gives such prominence to this class, for in numbers it is only a small proportion of the colored people, but it often dominates public opinion concerning the whole race. Happily, this class represents the black people of the South far below their normal physical and moral condition, but in its increase lies the possibility of grave dangers. I am sure there is no more urgent work before the white South, not only for its present happiness, but for its future safety, than the decreasing of this class of blacks. And it is not at all a hopeless class, for these men are but the creatures of conditions as much so as the slum and criminal elements of all the great cities of the world are creatures of conditions. Decreasing their number by shooting and burning them off will not be successful, for these men are truly desperate, and thoughts of death, however terrible, have little effect in deterring them from acts the result of hatred or degeneracy. This class of blacks hate everything covered by a white skin, and in return they are loathed by the whites. The whites regard them just about as a man would a vicious mule, a thing to be worked, driven, and beaten, and killed for kicking. The second class, as regards the relation between blacks and whites, comprises the servants, the washerwomen, the waiters, the cooks, the coachmen, and all who are connected with the whites by domestic service. These may be generally characterized as simple, kind-hearted, and faithful, not over-fine in their moral deductions, but intensely religious, and relatively, such matters can be judged only relatively, about as honest and wholesome in their lives as any other grade of society. Any white person is good who treats them kindly, and they love him for that kindness. In return, the white people with whom they have to do regard them with indulgent affection. They come into close daily contact with the whites and may be called the connecting link between whites and blacks. In fact, it is through them that the whites know the rest of their colored neighbors. Between this class of the blacks and the whites, there is little or no friction. The third class is composed of the independent workmen and tradesmen, and of the well-to-do and educated colored people. And, strange to say, for a directly opposite reason, they are as far removed from the whites as the members of the first class I mentioned. These people live in a little world of their own. In fact, I concluded that if a colored man wanted to separate himself from his white neighbors, he had but to acquire some money, education, and culture, and to live in accordance. For example, the proudest and fairest lady in the South could, with propriety, and it is what she would most likely do, go to the cabin of Aunt Mary, her cook, if Aunt Mary was sick, and minister to her comfort with her own hands. But if Mary's daughter Eliza, a girl who used to run round my lady's kitchen, but who has received an education and married a prosperous young colored man, were at death's door, my lady would no more think of crossing the threshold of Eliza's cottage than she would of going into a bar room for a drink. I was walking down the street one day with a young man who was born in Jacksonville, but had been away to prepare himself for a professional life. We passed a young white man, and my companion said to me, "You see that young man? We grew up together. We have played, hunted, and fished together. We have even eaten and slept together. And now, since I have come back home, he barely speaks to me." The fact that the whites of the South despise and ill-treat the desperate class of blacks is not only explainable according to the ancient laws of human nature, but it is not nearly so serious or important as the fact that as the progressive colored people advance, they constantly widen the gulf between themselves and their white neighbors. I think that the white people somehow feel that colored people who have education and money, who wear good clothes and live in comfortable houses, are putting on airs, that they do these things for the sole purpose of spiting the white folks, or are, at best, going through a sort of monkey-like imitation. Of course, such feelings can only cause irritation or breed disgust. It seems that the whites have not yet been able to realize and understand that these people, in striving to better their physical and social surroundings in accordance with their financial and intellectual progress, are simply obeying an impulse which is common to human nature the world over. I am in grave doubt as to whether the greater part of the friction in the South is caused by the whites having a natural antipathy to Negroes as a race, or an acquired antipathy to Negroes in certain relations to themselves. However that may be, there is, to my mind, no more pathetic side of this many-sided question than the isolated position into which are forced the very colored people who most need and who could best appreciate sympathetic cooperation. And their position grows tragic when the effort is made to couple them, whether or no, with the Negroes of the first class I mentioned. This latter class of colored people are well disposed towards the whites, and always willing to meet them more than halfway. They, however, feel keenly any injustice or gross discrimination, and generally show their resentment. The effort is sometimes made to convey the impression that the better class of colored people fight against riding in Jim Crow cars because they want to ride with white people or object to being with humbler members of their own race. The truth is, they object to the humiliation of being forced to ride in a particular car, aside from the fact that the car is distinctly inferior, and that they are required to pay full first-class fare. To say that the whites are forced to ride in the superior car is less than a joke. And too, odd as it may sound, refined colored people get no more pleasure out of riding with offensive Negroes than anybody else would get. I can realize more fully than I could years ago that the position of the advanced element of the colored race is often very trying. They are the ones among the blacks who carry the entire weight of the race question. It worries the others very little, and I believe the only thing which at times sustains them is that they know that they are in the right. On the other hand, this class of colored people get a good deal of pleasure out of life. Their existence is far from being one long groan about their condition. Out of a chaos of ignorance and poverty, they have evolved a social life of which they need not be ashamed. In cities where the professional and well-to-do class is large, they have formed society. Society as discriminating as the actual conditions will allow it to be. I should say, perhaps, society possessing discriminating tendencies which become rules as fast as actual conditions allow. This statement will, I know, sound preposterous, even ridiculous to some persons, but as this class of colored people is the least known of the race, it is not surprising. These social circles are connected throughout the country, and a person in good standing in one city is readily accepted in another. One who is on the outside will often find it a difficult matter to get in. I know personally of one case in which money to the extent of $30,000 or $40,000 and a fine house, not backed up by a good reputation, after several years of repeated effort, failed to gain entry for the possessor. These people have their dances and dinners and card parties, their musicals, and their literary societies. The women attend social affairs, dressed in good taste, and the men in dress suits which they own. And the reader will make a mistake to confound these entertainments with the bellman's balls, and whitewashers' picnics, and lime kiln clubs with which the humorous press of the country illustrates colored society. Jacksonville, when I was there, was a small town, and the number of educated and well-to-do colored people was small. So this society phase of life did not equal what I have since seen in Boston, Washington, Richmond, and Nashville, and it is upon what I have more recently seen in these cities that I have made the observations just above. However, there were many comfortable and pleasant homes in Jacksonville to which I was often invited. I belonged to the Literary Society, at which we generally discussed the race question, and attended all of the church festivals and other charitable entertainments. In this way, I passed 3 years which were not at all the least enjoyable of my life. In fact, my joy took such an exuberant turn that I fell in love with a young schoolteacher and began to have dreams of matrimonial bliss. But another turn in the course of my life brought these dreams to an end. I do not wish to mislead my readers into thinking that I led a life in Jacksonville which would make copy for the hero of a Sunday school library book. I was a hail fellow well met with all of the workmen at the factory, most of whom knew little and cared less about social distinctions. From their example I learned to be careless about money, and for that reason I constantly postponed and finally abandoned returning to Atlanta University. It seemed impossible for me to save as much as $200. Several of the men at the factory were my intimate friends, and I frequently joined them in their pleasures. During the summer months we went almost every Monday on an excursion to a seaside resort called Pablo Beach. These excursions were always crowded. There was a dancing pavilion, a great deal of drinking, and generally a fight or two to add to the excitement. I also contracted the cigar maker's habit of riding around in a hack on Sunday afternoons. I sometimes went with my cigar maker friends to public balls that were given at a large hall on one of the main streets. I learned to take a drink occasionally and paid for quite a number that my friends took, but strong liquors never appealed to my appetite. I drank them only when the company I was in required it, and suffered for it afterwards. On the whole, though I was a bit wild, I can't remember that I ever did anything disgraceful, or, as the usual standard for young men goes, anything to forfeit my claim to respectability. At one of the first public balls I attended, I saw the Pullman car porter who had so kindly assisted me in getting to Jacksonville. I went immediately to one of my factory friends and borrowed $15 with which to repay the loan my benefactor had made me. After I'd given him the money and was thanking him, I noticed that he wore what was, at least, an exact duplicate of my lamented black and gray tie. It was somewhat worn, but distinct enough for me to trace the same odd design which had first attracted my eye. This was enough to arouse my strongest suspicions, but whether it was sufficient for the law to take cognizance of, I did not consider. My astonishment and the ironical humor of the situation drove everything else out of my mind. These balls were attended by a great variety of people. They were generally given by the waiters of some one of the big hotels, and were often patronized by a number of hotel guests who came to see the sights. The crowd was always noisy, but good-natured. There was much quadrille dancing, and a strong-lunged man called figures in a voice which did not confine itself to the limits of the hall. It is not worth the while for me to describe in detail how these people acted. They conducted themselves in about the same manner as I have seen other people at similar balls conduct themselves. When one has seen something of the world and human nature, one must conclude, after all, that between people in like stations of life there is very little difference the world over. However, it was at one of these balls that I first saw the cakewalk. There was a contest for a gold watch, to be awarded to the hotel head waiter receiving the greatest number of votes. There was some dancing while the votes were being counted. Then the floor was cleared for the cakewalk. A half-dozen guests from some of the hotels took seats on the stage to act as judges, and 12 or 14 couples began to walk for a sure enough highly decorated cake which was in plain evidence. The spectators crowded about the space reserved for the contestants and watched them with interest and excitement. The couples did not walk round in a circle, but in a square, with the men on the inside. The fine points to be considered were the bearing of the men, the precision with which they turned the corners, the grace of the women, and the ease with which they swung around the pivots. The men walked with stately and soldierly step, and the women with considerable grace. The judges arrived at their decision by a process of elimination. The music and the walk continued for some minutes, then both were stopped while the judges conferred. When the walk began again, several couples were left out. In this way the contest was finally narrowed down to 3 or 4 couples. Then the excitement became intense. There was much partisan cheering, as one couple or another would execute a turn in extra elegant style. When the cake was finally awarded, the spectators were about evenly divided between those who cheered the winners and those who muttered about the unfairness of the judges. This was the cakewalk in its original form, and it is what the colored performers on the theatrical stage developed into the prancing movements now known all over the world, and which some Parisian critics pronounce the acme of poetic motion. There are a great many colored people who are ashamed of the cakewalk, but I think they ought to be proud of it. It is my opinion that the colored people of this country have done 4 things which refute the oft-advanced theory that they are an absolutely inferior race, which demonstrate that they have originality and artistic conception, and, what is more, the power of creating that which can influence and appeal universally. The first 2 of these are the Uncle Remus stories, collected by Joel Chandler Harris, and the Jubilee songs to which the Fisk singers made the public and the skilled musicians of both America and Europe listen. The other 2 are ragtime music and the cakewalk. No one who has traveled can question the world-conquering influence of ragtime, and I do not think it would be an exaggeration to say that in Europe the United States is popularly known better by ragtime than by anything else it has produced in a generation. In Paris they call it American music. The newspapers have already told how the practice of intricate cakewalk steps has taken up the time of European royalty and nobility. These are lower forms of art, but they give evidence of a power that will someday be applied to the higher forms. In this measure, at least, and aside from the number of prominent individuals the colored people of the United States have produced, the race has been a world influence, and all of the Indians between Alaska and Patagonia haven't done as much. Just when I was beginning to look upon Jacksonville as my permanent home, and was beginning to plan about marrying the young schoolteacher, raising a family, and working in a cigar factory the rest of my life, for some reason, which I do not now remember, the factory at which I worked was indefinitely shut down. Some of the men got work in other factories in town. Some decided to go to Key West and Tampa. Others made up their minds to go to New York for work. All at once, a desire like a fever seized me to see the North again, and I cast my lot with those bound for New York. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of the Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. We steamed up into New York Harbor late one afternoon in the spring. The last efforts of the sun were being put forth in turning the waters of the bay to glistening gold. The green islands on either side, in spite of their warlike mountings, looked calm and peaceful. The buildings of the town shone out in a reflected light which gave the city an air of enchantment. And truly it is an enchanted spot. New York City is the most fatally fascinating thing in America. She sits like a great witch at the gate of the country, showing her alluring white face and hiding her crooked hands and feet under the folds of her wide garments, constantly enticing thousands from far within, and tempting those who come from across the seas to go no farther. And all these become the victims of her caprice. Some she at once crushes beneath her cruel feet. Others she condemns to a fate like that of galley slaves. A few she favors and fondles, riding them high on the bubbles of fortune. Then with a sudden breath she blows the bubbles out and laughs mockingly as she watches them fall. Twice I had passed through it, but this was really my first visit to New York. And as I walked about that evening, I began to feel the dread power of the city. The crowds, the lights, the excitement, the gaiety, and all its subtler stimulating influences began to take effect upon me. My blood ran quicker, and I felt that I was just beginning to live. To some natures, this stimulant of life in a great city becomes a thing as binding and necessary as opium is to one addicted to the habit. It becomes their breath of life. They cannot exist outside of it. Rather than be deprived of it, they are content to suffer hunger, want, pain, and misery. They would not exchange even a ragged and wretched condition among the great crowd for any degree of comfort away from it. As soon as we landed, 4 of us went directly to a lodging house in 27th Street, just west of 6th Avenue. The house was run by a short, stout mulatto man, who was exceedingly talkative and inquisitive. In 15 minutes he not only knew the history of the past life of each one of us, but had a clearer idea of what we intended to do in the future than we ourselves. He sought this information so much with an air of being very particular as to whom he admitted into his house that we tremblingly answered every question that he asked. When we had become located, we went out and got supper, then walked around until about 10 o'clock. At that hour we met a couple of young fellows who lived in New York and were known to one of the members of our party. It was suggested we go to a certain place which was known by the proprietor's name. We turned into one of the cross streets and mounted the stoop of a house in about the middle of a block between 6th and 7th Avenues. One of the young men whom we had met rang a bell, and a man on the inside cracked the door a couple of inches, then opened it and let us in. We found ourselves in the hallway of what had once been a residence. The front parlor had been converted into a bar, and a half dozen or so well-dressed men were in the room. We went in, and after a general introduction had several rounds of beer. In the back parlor a crowd was sitting and standing around the walls of the room watching an exciting and noisy game of pool. I walked back and joined this crowd to watch the game, and principally to get away from the drinking party. The game was really interesting, the players being quite expert, and the excitement was heightened by the bets which were being made on the result. At times the antics and remarks of both players and spectators were amusing. When at a critical point a player missed a shot, he was deluged by those financially interested in his making it, with a flood of epithets synonymous with chump, while from the others he would be jeered by such remarks as, "Nigger, that cue ain't no hoe-handle." I noticed that among this class of colored men the word nigger was freely used in about the same sense as the word fellow, and sometimes as a term of almost endearment. But I soon learned that its use was positively and absolutely prohibited to white men. I stood watching this pool game until I was called by my friends, who were still in the bar room, to go upstairs. On the second floor there were 2 large rooms. From the hall I looked into the one on the front. There was a large round table in the center, at which 5 or 6 men were seated playing poker. The air and conduct here were greatly in contrast to what I had just seen in the pool room. These men were evidently the aristocrats of the place. They were, well, perhaps a bit flashily dressed, and spoke in low modulated voices, frequently using the word gentleman. In fact, they seemed to be practicing a sort of Chesterfieldian politeness towards each other. I was watching these men with a great deal of interest and some degree of admiration when I was again called by the members of our party, and I followed them on to the back room. There was a doorkeeper at this room, and we were admitted only after inspection. When we got inside, I saw a crowd of men of all ages and kinds grouped about an old billiard table, regarding some of whom, in supposing them to be white, I made no mistake. At first I did not know what these men were doing. They were using terms that were strange to me. I could hear only a confusion of voices exclaiming, "Shoot the 2! Shoot the 4! Fate me! Fate me! I've got you fated! 25 cents he don't turn!" This was the ancient and terribly fascinating game of dice, popularly known as craps. I myself had played pool in Jacksonville. It is a favorite game among cigar makers, and I had seen others play cards. But here was something new. I edged my way into the table and stood between one of my new-found New York friends and a tall, slender black fellow who was making side bets while the dice were at the other end of the table. My companion explained to me the principles of the game, and they are so simple that they hardly need to be explained twice. The dice came around the table until they reached the man on the other side of the tall black fellow. He lost, and the latter said, "Give me the bones." He threw $1 on the table and said, "Shoot the dollar." His style of play was so strenuous that he had to be allowed plenty of room. He shook the dice high above his head, and each time he threw them on the table he emitted a grunt such as men give when they are putting forth physical exertion with a rhythmic regularity. He frequently whirled completely around on his heels, throwing the dice the entire length of the table and talking to them as though they were trained animals. He appealed to them in short sing-song phrases. "Come, dice," he would say. "Little Phoebe, little Joe, way down yonder in the cornfield." Whether these mystic incantations were efficacious or not I could not say, but at any rate his luck was great, and he had what gamblers term nerve. "Shoot the dollar, shoot the 2, shoot the 4, shoot the 8," came from his lips as quickly as the dice turned to his advantage. My companion asked me if I'd ever played. I told him no. He said that I ought to try my luck, that everybody won at first. The tall man at my side was waving his arms in the air, exclaiming, "Shoot the 16! Shoot the 16! Fate me!" Whether it was my companion's suggestion or some latent daredevil strain in my blood which suddenly sprang into activity, I do not know. But with a thrill of excitement which went through my whole body, I threw a $20 bill on the table and said in a trembling voice, "I fate you." I could feel that I had gained the attention and respect of everybody in the room. Every eye was fixed on me, and the widespread question, "Who is he?" went around. This was gratifying to a certain sense of vanity of which I have never been able to rid myself, and I felt that it was worth the money even if I lost. The tall man, with a whirl on his heels and a double grunt, threw the dice. 4 was the number which turned up. This is considered as a hard point to make. He redoubled his contortions and his grunts and his pleadings to the dice, but on his 3rd or 4th throw the fateful 7 turned up, and I had won. My companion and all my friends shouted to me to follow up my luck. The fever was on me. I seized the dice. My hands were so hot that the bits of bone felt like pieces of ice. I shouted as loudly as I could, "Shoot it all!" but the blood was tingling so about my ears that I could not hear my own voice. I was soon fated. I threw the dice. 7s. I had won. "Shoot it all!" I cried again. There was a pause. The stake was more than one man cared to or could cover. I was finally fated by several men, taking each a part of it. I then threw the dice again. 7. I had won. "Shoot it all!" I shouted excitedly. After a short delay I was fated. Again I rolled the dice. 11. Again I won. My friends now surrounded me, and, much against my inclination, forced me to take down all of the money except $5. I tried my luck once more, and threw some small point which failed to make, and the dice passed on to the next man. In less than 3 minutes I had won more than $200, a sum which afterwards cost me dearly. I was the hero of the moment, and was soon surrounded by a group of men who expressed admiration for my nerve and predicted for me a brilliant future as a gambler. Although at the time I had no thought of becoming a gambler, I felt proud of my success. I felt a bit ashamed, too, that I had allowed my friends to persuade me to take down my money so soon. Another set of men also got around me, and begged me for 25 or 50 cents to put them back into the game. I gave each of them something. I saw that several of them had on linen dusters, and as I looked about I noticed that there were perhaps a dozen men in the room similarly clad. I asked the fellow who had been my prompter at the dice table why they dressed in such a manner. He told me that men who had lost all the money and jewelry they possessed frequently, in an effort to recoup their losses, would gamble away all their outer clothing and even their shoes, and that the proprietor kept on hand a supply of linen dusters for all who were so unfortunate. My informant went on to say that sometimes a fellow would become almost completely dressed, and then, by a turn of the dice, would be thrown back into a state of semi-nakedness. Some of them were virtually prisoners and unable to get into the streets for days at a time. They ate at the lunch counter, where their credit was good so long as they were fair gamblers and did not attempt to jump their debts, and they slept around in chairs. They importuned friends and winners to put them back in the game, and kept at it until fortune again smiled on them. I laughed heartily at this, not thinking the day was coming which would find me in the same ludicrous predicament. On passing downstairs, I was told that the third and top floor of the house was occupied by the proprietor. When we passed through the bar, I treated everybody in the room, and that was no small number, for 8 or 10 had followed us down. Then our party went out. It was now about 12:30, but my nerves were at such a tension that I could not endure the mere thought of going to bed. I asked if there was no other place to which we could go. Our guide said yes, and suggested that we go to the club. We went to 6th Avenue, walked 2 blocks, and turned to the west into another street. We stopped in front of a house with 3 stories and a basement. In the basement was a Chinese chop suey restaurant. There was a red lantern at the iron gate to the areaway, inside of which the Chinaman's name was printed. We went up the steps of the stoop, rang the bell, and were admitted without delay. From the outside, the house bore a rather gloomy aspect, the windows being absolutely dark, but within it was a veritable house of mirth. When we had passed through a small vestibule and reached the hallway, we heard mingled sounds of music and laughter, the clink of glasses, and the pop of bottles. We went into the main room, and I was little prepared for what I saw. The brilliancy of the place, the display of diamond rings, scarf pins, earrings, and breastpins, the big rolls of money that were brought into evidence when drinks were paid for, and the air of gaiety that pervaded the place, all completely dazzled and dazed me. I felt positively giddy, and it was several minutes before I was able to make any clear and definite observations. We at length secured places at a table in a corner of the room, and as soon as we could attract the attention of one of the busy waiters, ordered a round of drinks. When I had somewhat collected my senses, I realized that in a large back room into which the main room opened, there was a young fellow singing a song, accompanied on the piano by a short, thick-set, dark man. After each verse he did some dance steps, which brought forth great applause and a shower of small coins at his feet. After the singer had responded to a rousing encore, the stout man at the piano began to run his fingers up and down the keyboard. This he did in a manner which indicated that he was master of a good deal of technique. Then he began to play, and such playing! I stopped talking to listen. It was music of a kind I had never heard before. It was music that demanded physical response, patting of the feet, drumming of the fingers, or nodding of the head in time with the beat. The barbaric harmonies, the audacious resolutions, often consisting of an abrupt jump from one key to another, the intricate rhythms in which the accents fell in the most unexpected places, but in which the beat was never lost, produced a most curious effect. And, too, the player, the dexterity of his left hand in making rapid octave runs and jumps was little short of marvelous, and with his right hand he frequently swept half the keyboard with clean-cut chromatics which he fitted in so nicely as never to fail to arouse in his listeners a sort of pleasant surprise at the accomplishment of the feat. This was ragtime music, then a novelty in New York, and just growing to be a rage which has not yet subsided. It was originated in the questionable resorts about Memphis and St. Louis by Negro piano players who knew no more of the theory of music than they did of the theory of the universe, but were guided by natural musical instinct and talent. It made its way to Chicago, where it was popular some time before it reached New York. These players often improvised crude and, at times, vulgar words to fit the melodies. This was the beginning of the ragtime song. Several of these improvisations were taken down by white men, the words slightly altered, and published under the names of the arrangers. They sprang into immediate popularity and earned small fortunes, of which the Negro originators only got a few dollars. But I have learned that since that time a number of colored men of not only musical talent but training are writing out their own melodies and words and reaping the reward of their work. I have learned also that they have a large number of white imitators and adulterers. American musicians, instead of investigating ragtime, attempt to ignore it or dismiss it with a contemptuous word. But that has always been the course of scholasticism in every branch of art. Whatever new thing the people like is pooh-poohed. Whatever is popular is spoken of as not worth the while. The fact is, nothing great or enduring, especially in music, has ever sprung full-fledged and unprecedented from the brain of any master. The best that he gives to the world he gathers from the hearts of the people and runs it through the alembic of his genius. In spite of the bans which musicians and music teachers have placed upon it, the people still demand and enjoy ragtime. One thing that cannot be denied: it is music which possesses at least one strong element of greatness. It appeals universally. Not only the American, but the English, the French, and even the German people find delight in it. In fact, there is not a corner of the civilized world in which it is not known, and this proves its originality. For if it were an imitation, the people of Europe, anyhow, would not have found it a novelty. Anyone who doubts that there is a peculiar heel-tickling, smile-provoking, joy-awakening charm in ragtime needs only to hear a skillful performer play the genuine article to be convinced. I believe that it has its place as well as the music which draws from us sighs and tears. I became so interested in both the music and the player that I left the table where I was sitting and made my way through the hall into the back room, where I could see as well as hear. I talked to the piano player between the musical numbers and found out that he was just a natural musician, never having taken a lesson in his life. Not only could he play almost anything he heard, but he could accompany singers in songs he had never heard. He had, by ear alone, composed some pieces, several of which he played over for me. Each of them was properly proportioned and balanced. I began to wonder what this man with such a lavish natural endowment would have done had he been trained. Perhaps he wouldn't have done anything at all. He might have become, at best, a mediocre imitator of the great masters in what they have already done to a finish, or one of the modern innovators who strive after originality by seeing how cleverly they can dodge about through the rules of harmony and at the same time avoid melody. It is certain that he would not have been so delightful as he was in ragtime. I sat by, watching and listening to this man until I was dragged away by my friends. The place was now almost deserted. Only a few stragglers hung on, and they were all the worse for drink. My friends were well up in this class. We passed into the street. The lamps were pale against the sky. Day was just breaking. We went home and got into bed. I fell into a fitful sort of sleep, with ragtime music ringing continually in my ears. End of chapter 6.